The blood-stained letter shook in Delilah Vance's trembling hands as she ran through the moonlit Colorado wilderness, her father's threats echoing in her mind like thunderclaps. It was 1878, and she had finally done what she had sworn to do for years, escape the monster who had made her life a living hell since her mother's death. Delilah's lungs burned as she pushed through the dense underbrush, her tattered dress catching on brambles. She had fled from her family's ranch outside Telluride without a plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between herself and Silas Vance, the respected businessman whose public charm concealed a private tyranny. The bruises hidden beneath her sleeves were fading, but the fresh welts across her back stung with every stride. For 3 days, she had traveled on foot through mountainous terrain, surviving on wild berries and stream water, sleeping in hollowed logs and shallow caves. The 20-year-old had never ventured this far from home alone, but desperation drove her forward. Her father's latest rage had been triggered by her refusal of a marriage proposal from the town's aging banker, a man nearly 40 years her senior who had offered Silas a substantial business partnership in exchange for his only daughter. "You'll marry him or wish you had," her father had snarled, his belt already sliding from his waist. That night, after he had fallen into a drunken sleep, Delilah had packed what little she could carry and stolen away like a ghost. Now, as dawn threatened to break over the eastern horizon, exhaustion was overtaking her. Her vision blurred as she stumbled through a clearing and collapsed against a large oak, her body finally surrendering to fatigue. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats until they were nearly upon her. "Well now, what do we have here?" a deep voice called out. Delilah's head snapped up, terror flooding her veins. A tall figure on horseback emerged from the shadows, the brim of his hat obscuring his features in the dim light. He dismounted with practiced ease, his spurs jangling as his boots hit the ground. A cowboy. She scrambled to her feet, ready to flee again, but her legs betrayed her, buckling beneath her weight. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. "Easy there, miss. You're running from something fierce to be out here alone." "Let me go," she gasped, struggling against his hold. "I need to keep moving." "Run no more," he said firmly, his voice gentler than his grip. "Whatever's chasing you won't find you on my land." As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, Delilah looked up into the face of her captor. Piercing blue eyes studied her with concern beneath the brim of a weathered Stetson. His face was tanned and rugged, with several days of stubble darkening his jaw, but his expression held no malice, only curiosity and something that might have been compassion. "Isaac Winters," he introduced himself, helping her to stand. "And you look like you could use some breakfast and a safe place to rest." Delilah hesitated, years of her father's warnings about strangers, particularly men, echoing in her mind. But there was something in Isaac's steady gaze that quieted her fears. Or perhaps it was simply that she had no choice. She was lost, exhausted, and starving. "Delilah," she offered cautiously, withholding her surname. "Delilah V." She stopped herself. Using her family name might help her father track her. "Just Delilah." Isaac nodded, asking no further questions. He helped her onto his horse, mounting behind her with practiced ease. "My ranch is about a mile east of here. Mrs. Holloway, my housekeeper, will have coffee brewing and biscuits in the oven." As they rode in silence, Delilah felt her body sway with fatigue. Despite her fear, there was something comforting about the solid presence behind her, the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them. For the first time in days, perhaps years, she allowed herself to relax, if only slightly. Isaac's ranch appeared as they crested a hill, a modest but well-maintained homestead, nestled in a verdant valley. A 2-story clapboard house stood proudly at the center, flanked by a large barn, several outbuildings, and corrals holding horses and cattle. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, and the early morning sun cast the entire scene in golden light. As they approached, a portly woman with silver-streaked hair emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened at the sight of Delilah. "Land sakes, Mr. Winters, who's this you've brought home?" "A lost traveler, Mrs. Holloway," Isaac replied, dismounting before helping Delilah down. "Found her collapsed on the north property line." Mrs. Holloway's keen eyes took in Delilah's disheveled appearance, lingering briefly on the visible bruises at her wrists. Her expression softened. "Well, come in, child. You look half-starved. I've got breakfast nearly ready. And after that, you'll want a hot bath and proper rest." Inside, the house was simple but comfortable, polished wooden floors, sturdy furniture, and windows that filled the rooms with light. The kitchen smelled of coffee and fresh baked bread, making Delilah's stomach clench painfully with hunger. As Mrs. Holloway bustled about, serving plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits with gravy, Isaac maintained a respectful distance, watching Delilah with quiet interest. She ate ravenously, realizing only after she'd cleaned her plate how unladylike her behavior must have seemed. "I'm sorry," she murmured, embarrassed. "It's been a while since I've eaten properly." "No need to apologize," Isaac said, pouring her more coffee. "Mrs. Holloway's cooking has that effect on everyone." The housekeeper beamed with pride, then began clearing the dishes. "Now, I'll prepare that bath for you, Miss Delilah, and I think I can find some clean clothes that might fit you." Left momentarily alone with her rescuer, Delilah felt a sudden surge of anxiety. What was she doing here? She knew nothing about this man. His kindness might be genuine, but her father had taught her, sometimes painfully, that people often had hidden motives. "Mr. Winters," she began hesitantly, "I appreciate your hospitality, but I should continue on my way once I've rested." Isaac leaned back in his chair, regarding her thoughtfully. "Where are you headed?" The question caught her off guard. She had no destination, no plan beyond escape. I'm not entirely sure." "Then perhaps you should stay until you figure that out," he suggested. "I've got plenty of room, and Mrs. Holloway could use the company." "I'm often out with the herd." "I couldn't impose—" "It's no imposition," he interrupted gently. "And if I may be frank, Miss Delilah, you're in no condition to be wandering these hills alone. There are predators of both the four-legged and two-legged variety." The truth of his words stung, but Delilah couldn't deny their wisdom. She had no money, no supplies, and no knowledge of survival beyond what the last 3 days had harshly taught her. "Why would you help a stranger?" she asked bluntly. A shadow passed over Isaac's features. "Let's just say I recognize running when I see it, and sometimes a person needs a safe place to catch their breath before deciding where to go next." Before she could respond, Mrs. Holloway returned. "Your bath is ready, dear, and I've laid out some clothes that should fit well enough for now." Delilah followed the housekeeper upstairs, her mind whirling with uncertainty and cautious hope. The bath was heavenly hot water, soothing her aching muscles and washing away days of dirt and fear. The borrowed dress was simple but clean and only slightly too large. When she emerged, feeling more human than she had in days, Isaac was nowhere to be seen. "He's gone to tend the cattle," Mrs. Holloway explained, setting a cup of tea before Delilah. "Said to make yourself at home and that he'd be back by supper." "Mrs. Holloway," Delilah began carefully, "what can you tell me about Mr. Winters? I find myself in the unusual position of accepting hospitality from someone I know nothing about." The housekeeper smiled knowingly. "Isaac is a good man. Quiet. Keeps to himself mostly, but fair and honest. He came to Colorado about 5 years ago, bought this land when it was little more than wilderness, and built it into one of the finest small cattle operations in the county." She paused, studying Delilah. "He's never mentioned family, never brought a woman home before today. Whatever demons he's running from, he keeps them to himself." The revelation that her rescuer might have his own secrets was both unsettling and oddly comforting. Delilah sipped her tea, considering her options. She could rest today, regain her strength, and leave tomorrow with the first light. But to go where? "Get some sleep, child," Mrs. Holloway advised, seeming to read her thoughts. "Tomorrow will bring its own answers." The guest room was small but pleasant, with a comfortable bed and a window overlooking the valley. Despite her intention to remain alert, Delilah fell into a deep, dreamless sleep almost as soon as her head touched the pillow. She woke to evening shadows and the aroma of cooking food. For a disorienting moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then it all came flooding back: her escape, the cowboy, the sanctuary she'd found. Pulling on the borrowed dress, she made her way downstairs. Isaac had returned, freshly washed and changed into clean clothes. He stood when she entered the dining room, a gesture of respect she wasn't accustomed to receiving from men. "You look much recovered," he observed. "I hope you were able to rest well." "Better than I have in years," she admitted. "Thank you for your kindness." During the meal, a hearty stew with fresh bread, Isaac spoke of his day, the condition of his herd, plans for the coming winter. Normal conversation that made no demands of her. It wasn't until Mrs. Holloway had retired for the evening, leaving them alone by the fireplace, that he broached the subject of Delilah's presence. "I won't ask what you're running from," he said quietly, staring into the flames. "That's your business. But I want you to know you're welcome to stay as long as you need. No strings attached." Delilah studied his profile, trying to discern any hidden intent. Finding none, she took a deep breath. "My father," she said simply. "I'm running from my father." Isaac turned to face her, his expression carefully neutral. "I suspected as much. Those bruises weren't made by brambles or falls." She unconsciously touched her wrist where the marks of her father's fingers remained visible. "No," she whispered. "They weren't." "Is he looking for you?" "Almost certainly. He doesn't like losing what he considers his property." Isaac nodded grimly. "Well, he won't find you here. Not many people come this way, and those who do know better than to pry into my affairs." For the first time since she'd fled, Delilah felt the knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." "No repayment necessary," he said firmly. "But if you're staying a while, perhaps you'd be willing to help Mrs. Holloway with the household. She's not as young as she once was, though. Don't tell her I said so." A small smile tugged at Delilah's lips. "I can cook, clean, sew, whatever's needed." Then it settled. Isaac stood, stretching his tall frame. "Get some more rest. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure out the details." As days turned into weeks, Delilah found herself settling into life at the ranch. The work was hard but satisfying, so different from the oppressive chores her father had demanded. She helped Mrs. Holloway with cooking and cleaning, tended the kitchen garden, and even learned to collect eggs from the temperamental hens without getting pecked. She rarely saw Isaac during daylight hours. He left before dawn and often returned after dark, the demands of the ranch keeping him constantly busy. But each evening they shared supper, and afterward they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes reading in companionable silence. Bit by bit, she learned his story. Isaac had been a Union soldier, too young for most of the war, but catching its brutal tail end. Afterward, he drifted west, working cattle drives from Texas to Kansas before saving enough to buy his own land in Colorado. He spoke little of family, mentioning only a mother long dead and a father he described as best forgotten. In turn, she shared pieces of her own past, her mother's death when she was 12, her father's transformation from stern parent to tyrant, the isolation of their ranch outside Telluride where neighbors were too distant to hear or intervene. "He was always strict," she explained one evening, "but after Mother died, something broke in him. The drinking got worse and his temper. It became unpredictable. One moment he'd be reminiscing about Mother, the next he'd be accusing me of some imagined disrespect." Isaac listened without judgment, his steady gaze encouraging her to continue when words became difficult. The final straw was his arrangement with Mr. Caldwell, the town banker. Father owed him money, and Caldwell offered to forgive the debt in exchange for, she swallowed hard, for me, a marriage. I refused, and Father, her hand unconsciously went to her back where the scars were still healing. Isaac's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "You were right to leave." "I know," she whispered, "but I'm afraid. Not just of him finding me, but of what happens next. I have no money, no education beyond basic schooling, nowhere to go. You have time, Isaac assured her. Time to figure it out. And you're not alone anymore. As autumn painted the surrounding hills in fiery colors, Delilah discovered a newfound confidence. She learned to ride, at first nervously, but soon with growing skill. Isaac taught her how to handle a revolver. Just in case, he said, and she found she had a natural talent for shooting. Each small accomplishment built upon the last, creating a foundation of self-reliance she'd never known was possible. One crisp October morning, Mrs. Holloway announced she needed supplies from town. Delilah volunteered to accompany her, despite the risk. She couldn't hide forever, and the small settlement of Pine Creek, 20 miles east, was far enough from Telluride that news of her wouldn't likely have reached there. Isaac was hesitant but eventually agreed, insisting they take his wagon and be back before dark. "And take this," he added, pressing a small derringer into her hand. "Just keep it in your pocket. Hopefully, you won't need it." The trip to Pine Creek was exhilarating, Delilah's first venture into civilization since her escape. The town was smaller than Telluride, just a single street of businesses serving the surrounding ranches and farms. As they loaded supplies into the wagon, Delilah noticed a wanted poster nailed to the general store's bulletin board. Her heart stopped when she saw her own name. Missing. Delilah Vance, age 20, daughter of respected businessman Silas Vance of Telluride, believed to have been abducted. $500 reward for information leading to her safe return. There was no likeness of her, thankfully, but the description was detailed enough. Copper hair, green eyes, slender build, approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall. "Mrs. Holloway," she whispered urgently, "we need to leave, now." The housekeeper followed her gaze to the poster and nodded grimly. They finished their shopping in haste, avoiding conversation with the locals as much as possible. As they drove out of town, Delilah kept looking over her shoulder, convinced they were being followed. "Don't fret," Mrs. Holloway said, patting her hand. "No one in Pine Creek knows who you are, and even if they did, folks around here mind their own business." But Delilah couldn't shake her unease. Her father's reach was longer than she'd anticipated. The abduction story was clever. It made anyone helping her a criminal rather than a good Samaritan. And $500 was enough money to tempt even the most principled person. When they returned to the ranch, Isaac was waiting, his expression tight with concern. "You're late," he said, helping them down from the wagon. "We saw something in town," Mrs. Holloway explained. "Show him, Delilah." She described the poster, watching Isaac's face darken. "Abducted," he repeated. "That's a shrewd play. Makes it harder for you to seek help openly." "What do I do now?" Delilah asked, hating the tremor in her voice. "We continue as we have been," Isaac replied firmly. "But perhaps you should stay away from town for a while. I'll handle the supply runs personally." That night, after Mrs. Holloway had retired, Delilah found herself unable to sleep. She wandered downstairs to find Isaac still awake, cleaning his rifle by lamplight. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, not looking up from his task. She shook her head, settling into a chair across from him. "I keep thinking about what happens if he finds me." "He won't," Isaac said with quiet certainty. "Not here. You can't know that. He's persistent, and that reward will have every bounty hunter in Colorado looking for me." Isaac set down the rifle and met her gaze directly. "Delilah, I made you a promise when I found you. You don't need to run anymore. I meant it then, and I mean it now." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. Over the weeks, she'd grown to respect this quiet, honorable man. But lately, she'd found herself noticing other things about him, the way sunlight caught in his dark hair, the rare but transformative nature of his smile, the gentleness of hands strong enough to break a wild horse. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why risk so much for someone you barely know?" Isaac was silent for a long moment, his fingers tracing the wood grain of the rifle stock. "My mother," he finally said, "lived in fear of my father for 17 years. He never left marks where people could see them, and she never felt she could leave. The night he finally killed her, I was 15, too young to stop him, but old enough to make him pay for it. Delilah's hand went to her mouth in horror. Isaac. I was acquitted, he continued, his voice flat. Self-defense. But I couldn't stay in Virginia after that. Too many whispers, too many sideways looks. So I headed west, tried to outrun what happened. He looked up at her, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. When I found you in those woods, I saw my mother's fear in your eyes. I couldn't walk away, not this time. Without thinking, Delilah moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his calloused hand in hers. I'm so sorry. Don't be. It was a long time ago. He squeezed her hand gently before releasing it, creating distance between them again. You should get some rest. Tomorrow's another day. As winter descended on the Colorado mountains, the ranch became increasingly isolated. Heavy snows blocked the passes to town for days at a time, and the daily work of caring for the cattle and maintaining the property consumed their waking hours. Yet, Delilah found a strange peace in the routine, and in the growing certainty that, for now at least, she was safe. Her relationship with Isaac evolved slowly, cautiously. There were moments a lingering gaze across the dinner table, fingers brushing while passing a tool, the warmth of his coat draped around her shoulders when the evening air grew chill that hinted at something deeper than friendship. But neither seemed ready to acknowledge it, each bearing scars that made trust a precious, fragile commodity. Christmas approached, bringing with it a rare lightheartedness to the household. Mrs. Holloway baked constantly, filling the house with the aromas of gingerbread and apple pies. Isaac returned from his last trip to town before the heaviest snows, with not only supplies but small gifts as well, new gloves for Mrs. Holloway, a journal, and pencils for Delilah. I noticed you writing on scraps of paper, he explained somewhat awkwardly when she expressed surprise at the gift. Thought you might like something proper to write in. Delilah was touched by his thoughtfulness. It's perfect. Thank you. On Christmas Eve, after a special dinner of roast goose and all the trimmings, Isaac surprised them again by producing a fiddle from its case. I didn't know you played, Delilah said, delighted. He smiled, somewhat self-consciously. Not very well, and not very often, but Christmas seems to call for music. The simple carols he played filled the warmly lit room with nostalgia and joy. Mrs. Holloway hummed along, occasionally adding lyrics in her surprisingly melodious voice. For Delilah, it was a revelation, the first Christmas since her mother's death that hadn't been marked by her father's drunken rage or icy disapproval. Later, when Mrs. Holloway had gone to bed, Delilah and Isaac sat before the fire, sharing a rare glass of brandy. Thank you, she said softly, for giving me a Christmas worth remembering. You've brought something to this house it was missing, he replied, staring into the flames. Before you came, it was just a place I lived. Now it feels more like a home. The admission, so simply stated, made her heart skip. She reached out impulsively, touching his hand. Isaac. He turned his palm upward, his fingers interlacing with hers. For a long moment they sat in silence, connected by that simple touch. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised her hand to his lips, placing a gentle kiss on her knuckles. I care for you, Delilah, he said, his voice rough with emotion. More than I should, perhaps, but I need you to know that you owe me nothing. Your presence here comes with no obligations. She moved closer, her free hand coming up to touch his face. What if I want there to be more between us? Not from obligation, but from choice. The question hung in the air between them, laden with possibility. Isaac's eyes searched hers, looking for certainty. I've spent so long running from the past, he said quietly. I'm not sure I know how to build a future. Neither do I, she admitted, but perhaps we could learn together. When he kissed her, it was with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes. His hands cradled her face as if she were made of porcelain, his lips moving against hers with a reverence that spoke of long-held restraint finally released. Unlike the rough pawing she had endured from unwanted suitors in the past, Isaac's touch awakened something within her, a hunger for connection that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with desire. They parted breathlessly, foreheads touching. "We should be sensible," Isaac murmured, though his hands still framed her face. Delilah smiled, feeling bolder than she ever had. Perhaps, but not tonight. The weeks following Christmas were the happiest of Delilah's life. Though propriety was maintained for Mrs. Holloway's benefit, stolen moments of intimacy, a kiss in the barn, hands clasped beneath the dinner table, whispered conversations by firelight transformed her relationship with Isaac into something precious and thrilling. As winter began to loosen its grip on the land, however, reality intruded on their sanctuary. The first travelers through after the passes cleared brought news from beyond their isolated valley. Among the tales of blizzards and spring cattle prices was a more disturbing item. Silas Vance had expanded his search for his abducted daughter, hiring Pinkerton detectives to supplement the local bounty hunters. "Pinkertons don't give up easily," Isaac said grimly when they were alone. "And they have resources ordinary lawmen don't." "What do we do?" Delilah asked, the familiar fear returning like an unwelcome guest. Isaac paced the room, thinking. "We have options. We could leave, head further west, maybe to California or Oregon, start fresh where no one knows either of us." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Leave everything you've built here?" He stopped pacing, turning to face her with resolve. "A ranch is just land and buildings, Delilah. It can be replaced. You can't be." The declaration warmed her despite her fear. "There's another option," she said carefully. "I could go back, face him. I'm of legal age. He can't force me to marry anyone." "No." Isaac's response was immediate and fierce. "You know it wouldn't be that simple. A man who would beat his own daughter wouldn't hesitate to do worse if he felt his authority challenged publicly." He was right, and they both knew it. Silas Vance's reputation in Telluride was unimpeachable. His donations to the church, his generosity to widows and orphans, his position on the town council all created a public persona that few would question. Against his word, Delilah's accusations would find little support. "Then we leave," she decided. "Together." Isaac nodded, relief evident in his expression. "We'll need to plan carefully. Sell what we can, convert the rest to cash. Mrs. Holloway has a sister in Denver she's been wanting to visit. Perhaps it's time she took an extended trip." For the next 2 weeks, they prepared in secret. Isaac made trips to neighboring ranches, discreetly selling off portions of his herd. Delilah helped Mrs. Holloway pack for her visit, carefully explaining that she and Isaac would be traveling as well, though deliberately vague about their destination. Their departure date was set for April 10th, when a cattle buyer from Denver would arrive with cash for the remaining herd. They would leave before dawn the following day, taking only what could fit in a single wagon. But fate had other plans. 3 days before they were to leave, Delilah was alone in the house, Mrs. Holloway having left that morning for Denver. Isaac was in the south pasture, checking fences damaged by spring runoff. The sound of approaching horses drew her to the window. 3 riders were coming up the lane, 2 men in dark suits flanking a third figure she recognized with bone-chilling clarity. Silas Vance had found her. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but Delilah forced it down. She had changed in the months since her escape, grown stronger, more confident, and she wasn't defenseless. Moving quickly, she retrieved the derringer from its hiding place and slipped it into her pocket. Then she took a deep breath and stepped onto the porch to face her father. "Delilah," Silas Vance's voice was coldly formal as he dismounted. "It seems I've finally found my wayward daughter." He looked older than she remembered, the lines around his mouth deeper, his hair grayer. But his eyes were the same, hard and calculating, showing no relief at finding her alive and well. "Father," she acknowledged, keeping her voice steady, "you're trespassing on private property." He laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Is that any way to greet your worried father? I've been searching for months." The 2 men with him remained mounted, their expressions impassive. Pinkertons, she guessed, noting their city clothes and the subtle bulges beneath their jackets that suggested concealed weapons. "Your concern is touching," she replied, her tone deliberately ironic. especially given that your last expression of fatherly love left me unable to stand for 2 days. Silas's face hardened. You've always had a talent for exaggeration, Delilah. Now, get your things. We're leaving. No. The word came out stronger than she expected. I'm not going anywhere with you. Her father's false civility slipped, revealing the rage beneath. You most certainly are. I've spent good money and considerable time tracking you down. Mr. Caldwell is still willing to honor our arrangement despite your disgraceful behavior. I'm 20 years old, Delilah said firmly. I'll choose my own husband, if and when I decide to marry. Silas took a step forward, his hand rising as if to strike her. You ungrateful, I wouldn't do that if I were you. Isaac's voice cut through the tension like a knife. He stood at the edge of the yard, rifle in hand, having approached silently during their confrontation. The lady has made her wishes clear. Silas turned, sizing up the newcomer with practiced disdain. And who might you be? The kidnapper who's been hiding my daughter. Isaac Winters. This is my ranch, and Miss Delilah is here of her own free will. The Pinkertons shifted uneasily, hands moving toward their weapons. Isaac's rifle didn't waver. I suggest you gentlemen keep those hands visible, he said calmly. I have no quarrel with you, but I will defend what's mine. Silas sneered. Yours? So you've taken not only my daughter, but her virtue as well? I'll see you hang for this, cowboy. Father, enough. Delilah moved to stand beside Isaac, her anger finally overcoming her fear. I ran away. No one abducted me. I ran because you were going to sell me like cattle to a man 3 times my age, because you've spent years using your fists to control me, just as you did with Mother. Silas's face went white with fury. You will not speak of your mother. She died of illness, you told everyone, Delilah continued, the words pouring out after years of silence. But I saw the bruises. I heard her crying at night. You killed her slowly, just as you were killing me. One of the Pinkertons cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mr. Vance, you hired us to find your daughter, which we've done. Family disputes are outside our jurisdiction. She's coming home with me, Silas insisted, his composure slipping further. I'll deal with her disrespect appropriately. Isaac stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Delilah. Mr. Vance, I'm going to ask you once, politely, to leave my property. Your daughter is staying here, where she's safe and respected. Silas's hand moved to his coat, but before he could draw whatever weapon he carried, Delilah produced her derringer, pointing it steadily at her father's chest. Don't, she warned, her voice low. I've become quite a good shot. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Silas Vance's eyes. He glanced from his daughter to the armed rancher beside her, then to the Pinkertons, who were clearly unwilling to risk their lives for what had become a domestic dispute. This isn't over, he snarled. The law will hear about this. No judge will side with a kidnapper over a father's rights. Perhaps, Isaac replied evenly, but they might listen to evidence of abuse. There are witnesses in Telluride who've seen the results of your discipline, Mr. Vance. Good people who've stayed silent out of fear or misplaced respect. How will your standing in the community weather that kind of scrutiny? It was a gamble Delilah knew as well as Isaac that proving abuse would be difficult, especially against someone of her father's social position. But the threat of public scandal was something Silas Vance couldn't ignore. You're making a grave mistake, her father said, but there was a new wariness in his tone. Both of you. The only mistake was not leaving you sooner, Delilah replied, her hand steady on the derringer. Goodbye, father. Don't come looking for me again. For a long, tense moment, Silas Vance stared at his daughter as if seeing her truly for the first time. Then, without another word, he mounted his horse and wheeled around, spurring the animal harder than necessary as he galloped away. After an awkward moment, the Pinkertons tipped their hats and followed. Only when the riders had disappeared from sight did Delilah lower the derringer, her hand finally beginning to shake. Isaac immediately pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him. You were magnificent, he whispered into her hair. So brave, she clung to him. the adrenaline of confrontation giving way to delayed shock. Do you think he'll really leave us alone? I don't know, Isaac answered honestly, but we'll be ready if he doesn't. That evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Isaac took Delilah's hand in his. I still think we should leave, he said quietly. Not out of fear, but because a fresh start somewhere new might be good for both of us. Delilah considered this, looking out over the land that had become her sanctuary. What about the ranch? All your hard work? Land can be bought anywhere. What I can't replace is you. He turned to face her fully. Delilah, I want to build a life with you wherever that may be. I love you, and if you'll have me, I want to marry you. Joy bloomed in her chest, spreading warmth to every part of her being. Yes, she said simply, tears pricking her eyes. Yes, I'll marry you. Their kiss was a promise of protection, of partnership, of a future where neither of them would need to run anymore. 2 days later, after selling the remainder of his herd to the Denver buyer, Isaac and Delilah were married by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through. The ceremony was simple, witnessed only by the cattle buyer and his assistant, but the love binding them needed no elaborate trappings. They left Colorado the following morning, heading west toward California with their worldly possessions loaded in a sturdy wagon and their hearts full of hope. Isaac had written to a former Army comrade who owned land in the Sacramento Valley fertile ground where they could start anew, far from the shadows of their past. The journey was long and not without hardship. Spring storms turned roads to mud, delaying their progress. A broken wagon wheel cost them 3 days and precious dollars for repairs. At a river crossing in Utah, they nearly lost their team to the swift current, but each challenge they faced together, strengthening the bond between them. At night, beneath star-scattered skies, they would make love in the privacy of their canvas-covered wagon, discovering each other's bodies with tender reverence. Isaac's touch healed something in Delilah that had been broken long before her father's physical abuse began the belief that she was unworthy of genuine love, and in turn, her unwavering faith in him helped Isaac finally lay to rest the ghosts of his own violent past. By early June, they reached the rolling hills of Northern California, where orchards and vineyards replaced the cattle ranches of Colorado. Isaac's friend, Marcus Sullivan, welcomed them warmly to his sprawling property near Sacramento, offering them temporary lodging while they searched for land of their own. It took nearly a month of looking before they found what they wanted: 50 acres of fertile valley land, with a small but sound farmhouse, a barn needing minor repairs, and an orchard of mature apple and pear trees. The price was steep, consuming most of their savings, but when Delilah stood on the porch of what would be their home, watching Isaac inspect the barn with critical eyes, she knew they had made the right choice. "What do you think?" he asked, returning to her side. "Can you be happy here?" She smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I'm already happy. The where doesn't matter nearly as much as the who." Their first year on the new farm brought both joy and hardship. The apple harvest was bountiful, but prices were lower than expected. Winter brought unusually heavy rains that damaged part of the barn roof. And in early spring, Delilah discovered she was with child news that filled them both with exhilaration and trepidation. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" she asked Isaac one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sun set behind distant mountains. "A baby changes everything." He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach, wonder in his eyes. "I can't imagine anything better than creating a family with you, giving a child the love and security we both missed growing up." The months of her pregnancy passed in a blur of preparation. Isaac expanded the farmhouse, adding a nursery adjacent to their bedroom. Delilah sewed tiny garments, each stitch a promise to the child growing within her. They discussed names endlessly, wanting something with meaning but not burdened by the weight of the past. On a stormy night in November 1879, after 18 hours of labor that tested the limits of her endurance, Delilah gave birth to a son healthy, strong, lunged, and perfect in every way. They named him Thomas, after Isaac's grandfather, the one relative he spoke of with genuine affection. "He has your eyes," Isaac whispered, cradling his newborn son with hands that trembled slightly from emotion. "And your strength." Delilah, exhausted but radiant, watched her husband and child with a heart so full it threatened to overflow. "And your stubbornness, I suspect." He certainly took his time making an appearance. As their son grew, so did their farm. Isaac's skill with animals and Delilah's head for business proved a formidable combination. They expanded beyond apples to include peaches and cherries, hiring seasonal workers for the harvests, and gradually building a reputation for quality that commanded premium prices in Sacramento markets. When Thomas was 3, a letter arrived from Mrs. Holloway in Denver, containing news that Silas Vance had died a stroke, according to the newspaper announcement she'd enclosed. Delilah read the obituary with a strange numbness, feeling neither grief nor relief, only a dull acknowledgement that a chapter of her life was irrevocably closed. "Are you all right?" Isaac asked that night, holding her close in their bed. "I think so," she replied thoughtfully. "I mourned the father I needed years ago. This is just the end of a story I've already finished reading." 2 years later, their daughter arrived, Elizabeth, named for Isaac's mother. Unlike her brother's dramatic entrance, Eliza came into the world quickly, almost impatiently, as if eager to join the family waiting for her. She had Delilah's copper hair, but Isaac's quiet intensity, observing the world with solemn curiosity from the cradle. As their children grew, Delilah sometimes marveled at how different their childhood was from her own. There were no fearful silences, no walking on eggshells to avoid paternal rage. Instead, their home was filled with laughter, with music from Isaac's fiddle on winter evenings, with the comfortable chaos of family life. Of course, there were challenges. The drought of 1885 nearly ruined them, saved only by the well Isaac had insisted on digging the previous year. Thomas broke his arm falling from an apple tree at age 8, terrifying his parents, but earning a story he would tell proudly for years afterward. And Eliza's stubborn independence led to more than one heart-stopping moment of maternal panic when she wandered off to explore. But through it all, the foundation Isaac and Delilah had built remained unshaken, a partnership of equals, bound by love and respect. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Isaac surprised Delilah with a gift that brought tears to her eyes, a silver locket containing miniature portraits of their children, engraved with words that encapsulated their journey. "Run no more." "Do you ever regret it?" she asked that night as they sat on their porch, watching fireflies dance in the twilight. "Giving up your ranch in Colorado for this?" Isaac shook his head, drawing her closer against his side. "Not for a single moment. Everything worthwhile in my life began the morning I found you in those woods. Even when I talk too much, or when I rearrange your tools in the barn," she teased. "Especially then," he replied with a smile, pressing a kiss to her temple. "The imperfections are what make it real, Delilah. And real is all I've ever wanted." As the years passed, their farm prospered, eventually becoming one of the most successful in the county. Thomas, inheriting his father's affinity for the land, worked alongside Isaac with growing skill and confidence. Eliza, to her parents' initial surprise, displayed a remarkable aptitude for numbers and business, keeping the farm's books with precision by the time she was 16. When Thomas married the daughter of a neighboring farmer at 22, the celebration was held in the orchard, trees heavy with blossoms promising another bountiful harvest. Watching her son exchange vows beneath the same trees that had welcomed them to this land so many years ago, Delilah felt a circle completing. "They remind me of us," Isaac murmured, his arm around her waist as they watched the young couple's first dance. "Young, maybe a little afraid, but so full of hope." Delilah leaned into him, marveling at how, even after more than 2 decades together, his touch still kindled warmth within her. "But they're starting with so much more than we had, no one chasing them, no demons to exorcise." "That was our gift to them," Isaac said, breaking the chain. 3 years later, They became grandparents when Thomas and his wife welcomed twins, a boy and a girl, who quickly became the center of their grandparents' world. Watching Isaac with the babies, his weathered hands so gentle as he cradled them, Delilah felt a renewal of the love that had sustained them through good times and bad. "You're even more handsome now than when I met you," she told him one night as they prepared for bed, the silver at his temples catching the lamplight. He laughed, pulling her close. "And you're still a terrible liar, but I love you for it." "Not a lie," she insisted, touching his face. "Just a different kind of handsome, one that comes from living a good life, from being the kind of man who keeps his promises." In the spring of 1905, as they approached their 30th wedding anniversary, Isaac suffered a mild heart attack while working in the fields. Though he recovered, the incident forced them to acknowledge their mortality in ways they'd previously avoided. Thomas and his family moved into the main house, while Isaac and Delilah took up residence in the smaller cottage they'd built on the property years earlier for seasonal workers. "Are you disappointed?" Delilah asked as they settled into their new home. "Having to step back from daily management of the farm?" Isaac shook his head, looking out over the land that had sustained them for so long. "I've done what I set out to do. Built something lasting, something our children and grandchildren can build upon. Now it's time to enjoy the fruits of our labor." And enjoy them they did. Freed from the physical demands of farming, they found new pleasures in their later years. Isaac took up wood carving, creating intricate toys for their grandchildren. Delilah, whose journal writing had evolved into a talent for storytelling, began recording the history of their farm and family, a legacy for future generations. They traveled occasionally to San Francisco to see the grand buildings rising after the earthquake, to Yellowstone to marvel at its natural wonders, even once all the way to New York City, where the noise and crowds fascinated and overwhelmed them in equal measure. But always, they returned to the land they loved, to the home they had built together from nothing but hope and determination. On a golden afternoon in October, 1911, as they sat beneath their favorite apple tree watching their great-grandchildren play, Delilah reached for Isaac's hand, her fingers intertwining with his as naturally as breathing. "Do you remember what you said to me the day we met?" she asked, her voice soft with memory. He smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with genuine happiness. "I believe it was something about running no more. The best advice anyone ever gave me," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder, "because it led me here, to you, to all of this." Isaac pressed a kiss to her silver hair, his heart as full at 75 as it had been at 30. "You saved me too, you know. I was just as lost as you were, in my own way." "Then we found each other," Delilah said simply, "and neither of us had to run again." As the sun began its descent behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades reminiscent of that long-ago Colorado evening when Isaac had proposed, they sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the legacy of their love, the land they had nurtured, the family they had created, the peace they had fought so hard to find. They had both begun their journey as runners, fleeing from different demons but seeking the same salvation. And in each other, they had found not just refuge, but home, the kind that exists not in a place but in the heart, built on a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. In the end, that was the greatest gift they gave each other, the courage to stop running and start living, to transform fear into love, pain into joy, and a chance encounter in the wilderness into a lifetime of happiness. And as twilight gathered around them, Delilah knew with bone-deep certainty that no matter what the future held, whether they had 5 more years together or 15, they would face it as they had faced everything else. Together, hand in hand, running no more.